All right, so last week we took a look at the stock market crash, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. We took a look at how the stock market works. We took a look at how a crash like the one that happened there would take place. We took a look at the specific indicators of things that were happening in the 1920s that led to the bubble that ultimately crashed on October 29th, 1929. We took a look at how the American people reacted to that crash and how the reaction to a crash like that will plunge you into something like the Great Depression. We also took a look at the specific actions of the American people during the 1920s and how those policies of trickle-down supply-side economics that had created the Roaring Twenties also weakened the United States economy to the point where we were ripe for something like the crash and ultimately the Great Depression. We took a look at how Yankee imperialism had destroyed the American ability to trade with foreign countries, and we took a look at how high tariffs and had also played their role. We also took a look at how the trickle-down economics of the tax breaks for the wealthy had created a pyramid of wealth. And we also finished last week with taking a look at the plight of the farmer and how even if you were somebody who hadn't invested in the stock markets and had pretty much kept your nose down and you were continuing to work and trying to put your money in the banks, even those people were felt by the stock market crash Black Tuesday. What we want to take a look at here today is how you go from the stock market crash and how things plunge into a depression, and how by 1932 the depression was setting in pretty hard. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the person who ends up holding the blame for a lot of this is the President of the United States. At the time, it was Herbert Hoover. Now, you have to understand something. These types of things aren't necessarily the president's fault. And this is one of the interesting things about American politics and the American economy is we tend to want to lay blame and as well as we want to put praise on the president. And more often than not, a lot of these types of things don't necessarily revolve around the actions of the president. You know, for example, when you take a look at the 1990s, Bill Clinton had a way of making the American people feel like the economy was doing really well. And it was because he was president and he had done so many things. Well, the fact is, there were a number of different elements at play at the time. You see technologically, the technology boom of Silicon Valley and some of the other stuff that was taking place in the 1990s. A lot of that was fueling these new markets that were starting to create the economic wealth of the 1990s. And Bill Clinton happened to be the president who cashed in on that. And the American people felt secure that he was doing things well. On the opposite end of the spectrum, 6 months into George W. Bush's presidency, the 9/11 attacks take place. They hijack his presidency, and we see a lot of the economic turmoil that was a result of that during the Bush years. That's not necessarily George Bush's fault. An attack like that takes years to coordinate. He'd only been in office for 6 months. And what do you think is going to happen to the American economy when the World Trade Centers are destroyed? Long story short, a lot of times the American people tend to blame the president, and the Great Depression wasn't any different. Herbert Hoover had been elected president in 1928. Less than a year before the stock market crash took place, he took office. He takes office in January, February of 1929. The stock market crashes 9 months later, October 29th. These things that ultimately these elements that led to the stock market crash were not his fault. Now, to be honest, Herbert Hoover had played a very large role in the previous two administrations of Warren Harding as well as Calvin Coolidge. So he's not blameless in any of this. He had definitely been an advisor who had played a role in what all the policies that had led to the stock market crash. But as president of the United States, it wasn't his fault. That doesn't matter. The American people still see him as the person who's holding the hot potato whenever the music stops, and therefore he takes the blame. And in fact, and at this point in time, you have to understand something. The way that the American government is structured, the president is not a king. He's not a monarch. He can't just do what he wants. The only way for a president to get something done is he has to work through Congress, and he only does that through the will of the people. A popular president gets things done. An unpopular president doesn't have much of a chance. And so when you see the American people blaming Herbert Hoover for their troubles during the Great Depression, this is a serious problem. And in fact, the element that we have that would show you the degree to which Americans blamed Herbert Hoover when they lost their homes, when they were forced to live out in shacks and shanties on the outskirts of cities because they couldn't have their houses anymore because they'd lost their life savings, they'd lost their jobs, they couldn't pay utilities, they'd sold everything that they could possibly sell. The homes that they had to create, they called Hoovervilles. They named it after Herbert Hoover because they blamed their troubles on him. So, for example, you take a look at the magnitude of the poverty. Here's a Hooverville that was located outside of Chicago, and you can see the magnitude of the number of people who would have lost their homes and are now living in shacks and shanties, and they're blaming the president for their troubles. Here's a specific Hooverville. A specific home in a Hooverville. When I looked at the resources to find this picture, this shack, this shanty, houses a family of 8 people. And so these are the types of situations we're talking about where the American people have lost everything, and this is the degree of poverty that they're living in, and they're blaming the president. Not only this, we also see, once again, perception is everything for the president at times. You know, if Donald Trump during these trying times wants to get something accomplished, he needs the perception that the American people can trust him and he can get stuff done. This is not that much different than during the Great Depression. An active president needs to build trust with the American people. So perception is everything in some of these cases. And not only was the American public blaming Herbert Hoover for their troubles, but we saw a number of other elements at play. And one of the most public elements that destroyed the American people's trust in Herbert Hoover was an event we call the Bonus Army. Now, today we have the GI Bill, where soldiers who enlist, when they're done, they get through the GI Bill, they get various different benefits that the government will pay for. A lot of times it's regard to bonus checks as well as money that goes towards higher education and training for those soldiers after they're done with their enlistment. Back in the 1920s and the early 1930s, we didn't have the GI Bill. It wasn't created until after World War II. However, what we did have was during World War I, soldiers who had served in the Army were guaranteed what they called bonus checks. And what those bonus checks were is they were a couple $1,000 checks that the government had promised to those soldiers, because keep in mind, during World War I, the economy was booming back here at home. You could have made a lot of money working in factories, building bombs and building all the supplies that were possibly going to be used over in Europe during the war. And so those soldiers who volunteered to sign up for the Army were forfeiting amount of profits that they could have made if they'd stayed home and they'd worked instead. And so what the government did after World War I is they had an agreement with those soldiers that there was a certain amount of money that the government had figured those soldiers would have earned if they had stayed home. And at a later date, 20 years after the war, the soldiers were going to get a check from the government for that money that they were supposed to receive during the war, where they called them bonus checks. Now, at the time, whenever the stock market crashed and the Great Depression hit, they were still about a good 5 years away from collecting those checks. So what these soldiers did, these veterans from World War I, is they petitioned the government to give them those checks early. They weren't asking for handouts. They weren't asking for the government to give them any extra specific help during the war, during the Great Depression. What these soldiers were asking for was from these bonus checks that the government had already promised them to be delivered early during this period of time that they were in so much need. Now, you have to understand something. When people petition for this type of thing, the president can't just wave a wand and grant it to them. In fact, Herbert Hoover even supported them at first and wanted to help the soldiers. But Congress makes that call. And so what happened at the time was Congress was afraid that if they gave too much of that money too early, they would deplete their funding and not be able to help dig the United States economy through the Depression. And so they refused these soldiers their funding. And so when World War I soldiers were petitioned for these bonus checks and they were denied, once again, they blamed Herbert Hoover. And so what we saw was thousands of World War I veterans flocking to Washington, D.C. to specifically petition the government, the president in particular, to get those bonus checks early during the Great Depression. And when the government refused to give them those bonus checks, they created Hoovervilles just outside the White House on the Washington Mall, out by the Washington Monument, and they started to protest Herbert Hoover and the government. At first, Herbert Hoover was even sympathetic to them, even sent them food and sent them cots to sleep in. But the problem is you can peacefully petition according to the Constitution of the United States, but you can only do so with certain parameters. After a while, the group started to get too large. It started to become a health hazard. Eventually, the government ordered the bonus army to disband. They refused. The situation started to get ugly as the soldiers started to get hungry. And eventually, Herbert Hoover had to order them to leave. Obviously, these soldiers from the bonus army refused to leave, and eventually it got so ugly that Herbert Hoover had to order the National Guard to violently remove 2,000 World War I veterans from the National Mall because they refused to leave the Capitol. And once again, perception is everything. When you see in the midst of this crisis, the president is ordering the National Guard to violently burn down the Hoovervilles that the soldiers are living in, these World War I veterans, and violently be removed by their government, this is not good. So as we enter the election of 1932, we have a Republican president, Herbert Hoover, who is calling for a lot of those same policies of the Roaring '20s that had led us into this. Herbert Hoover's stance is, once again, not necessarily wrong. Herbert Hoover felt that if the United States government gave money directly to the American people, they would teach the American people to become dependent on the government. And he said, therefore, that's not a good solution. Herbert Hoover's solution to the problems was to give money to businesses, not the average person. Now, the average person looks at this and says, Herbert Hoover is the president of the United States. Everything was going really well. Then he gets elected. The stock market crashes. The Great Depression takes place. Things are going terrible now. They blame Herbert Hoover. They're living in Hoovervilles. They see the bonus army. They see the things that have taken place. And he had the National Guard violently remove World War I veterans from the mall. And then they see the fact that Herbert Hoover is repeatedly vetoing any bill that would give them direct aid during this crisis, but he's willing to give money to the businesses that laid them off. So the American people are very upset. In stark contrast, Herbert Hoover is very unpopular, but the man he's running against in the election of 1932 is a rising star, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's perspective was the polar opposite of Herbert Hoover. He said the only entity in America that is large enough to handle something like this is the United States government. He said the government's job is not to turn a profit. The government's job is to help the American people and to serve the American people. And so FDR's stance was very simple. Unlike Herbert Hoover, the American people were struggling during the Depression, and he was going to give them direct aid straight to the people. He was going to create programs that would find jobs funded by the government. He would create new programs that would directly provide aid and unemployment relief to the American people so they could pay their bills and keep their families fed. This is an incredibly popular solution. And on top of all of that, one of the ways that FDR suggested that he could pay for a lot of this, well, he was going to end prohibition. If the American people were allowed to start buying alcohol again, guess what they could do? They could tax those alcohol sales to help fund this. So at a time when the American people are struggling and Herbert Hoover's not very popular and he's vetoing bills that would help them get through, but he's helping the very companies that laid them off, the American people are upset. And the alternative is a rising star who's going to give them direct aid, use government funding to create jobs, and who's going to repeal prohibition, which had been very unsuccessful and very unpopular, and he's going to use that money to let the American people climb their way out of the Great Depression. And so it's obvious that in 1932, FDR wins in a landslide, and next week we're going to start taking a look at the things that FDR did to keep the American people going during the Depression.